If I can reach my people in Puerto Rico, it's like, guys, you need to get smarter about what you're asking for, right? And you need to understand the wisdom of the patriarch of Puerto Rico, which is el estatus no está en issue, right? Forget about status. Status is the problem. Infrastructure is the problem. Economy is the problem.
Welcome to episode 21 of the David Binkowski podcast. Today's episode features a conversation exclusively around Puerto Rico, its relationship with the U.S. There are two bills that are going to the House floor for a vote that could impact Puerto Rico, although we'll see if they actually make it there. And the timing of this discussion comes on the heels of the address Joe Biden just gave to Congress, in which he's laying out all the U.S. big bets and their priorities that will lift the U.S.'s poor and middle class with a heavy, heavy emphasis on infrastructure. Now, there was no mention of Puerto Rico during this address. As someone who moved to Puerto Rico almost 3 years ago at this point, and who spent 45 years in the U.S., I can tell you I have a pretty good perspective on how the island's viewed and the reality for the push that is statehood. Many pro-statehood people on Twitter like to argue that I don't know what I'm talking about, when in reality last night and the lack of support for the House bill to make Puerto Rico a state that is making its way through D.C. barely proves everything that I and others have been saying. There's nothing personal. There's nothing malicious. It is called fact-facing and reality. So given this, unless there are major changes to how Puerto Rico governs itself and continues to prop up Fortune 500s and the wealthy as a tax haven, there will not be any real consideration given to Puerto Rico's statehood, no matter how much people want to scream about it on social media. Again, Biden's address didn't mention Puerto Rico or statehood once. He is making big, big bets to try to save the U.S. from autocracy. And thanks to gerrymandering, redistricting, voter suppression, and all the other bullshit the GOP is pulling, it may not be enough. I'm fairly optimistic. We'll see what happens, but I'm fairly optimistic, but it's still going to take the U.S. decades to undo the poison, the rhetoric, and the hate that the Trump campaign sowed in the U.S. in just the 4 short years that he was in office. So given this, I think it's worth looking at alternatives. There's the other bill that's being passed around D.C. is for self-determination. And self-determination means that Puerto Rico gets to look at itself and truly look at all the options and then figure out what makes the most sense. Now, geopolitically, I don't think the U.S. is going to say, go ahead and leave. Financially, probably a similar argument, but I think it's worth looking at how we got here. So the 10,000-foot overview on Puerto Rico's history with the U.S. is that the Spanish colonized the Taino people who were native to this island many, many years ago. And eventually, Spain left and the U.S. stepped in. The U.S. decided to give Puerto Rico citizenship, which sounds amazing. You are U.S. citizens. It's worth noting the reason why they did that. They wanted to fill draft roles for the World War. There already was an independence movement here in Puerto Rico. And it's worth noting in this same era, Don Pedro Albizu Campo served in the U.S. military in 1917. And he also suffered harsh racism from the U.S. He became the head of the Puerto Rican independence movement and ended up going to jail later on. But I was thinking about this after it happened back in January. The only other time the Capitol has been shot up in U.S. history was in the 50s by 4 Puerto Rican independence movement party members. So, there's a very sordid and deep history that feel free to look into more stuff. It's all online. There are videos There are, books, there are websites, etc. But the reality is that Puerto Ricans have suffered mistreatment for years, whether it's forced sterilizations, that was a thing. Bombings, that was a thing. In fact, still bombs over on Vieques. Murder and torture up at Ramey Air Force Base, that's a thing. That happened. Or, just something like the crushing illegal debt that the island has no right to renegotiate and is currently suffocating us through a financial oversight board who's running austerity measures and cutting stuff. Oddly enough, we have actually representation in Congress, Jennifer Gonzalez, and she's a Republican. Of all the trends you see happening in the U.S., we're sending a Republican to ask for statehood after setting up a tax haven. And also Jennifer said as part of their presentation of their bill for statehood that they don't want the debt canceled. This illegal debt, they don't want canceled. I mean, big fucking yikes, right? But you add it all up, chasing statehood is like chasing a unicorn. It ain't going to happen. And focusing on it is a waste of time, energy, effort, and money that should be going to help everyday Puerto Ricans. Again, you can fall in love with the U.S. and the U.S. way of life and the consumerism and the brands and all those things. As someone who lives here, I'm telling you, man, we have it different here. Our culture, the culture in Puerto Rico is very different than the U.S. And while we do have people here who do speak English, although some of the people they're sending to testify in Congress will not be, inexplicably, the reality is it's different. It's different living here. So in this episode, what we're going to talk about is kind of where things could go and where's the opportunity and what needs to happen. And, it's with my friend Arturo. He's been on before. Arturo is the SportsGrid's CTO. He is Puerto Rican. And he has a very rich history of working not just on the island, but around the world in trying to bring solutions. And he has some good ideas for this island as well. His father was involved too. So, I mean, you're talking about a lot of great history here. So we're going to get into that conversation. But if you're not following me on Twitter before we start, give me a follow. I'm D. Binkowski. And Arturo is American Numbers on Twitter. His account is private. So as long as you're cool, you should be okay. If you don't want to hear his opinions and just want to read his data, you can go to Data Strictly on Twitter. And that's like just NBA stuff or whatever's going on with charts and his algorithms and the models he's set up that he runs. So it's all interesting and worth looking at. But you're going to see, not a lot of opinion, just numbers. Finally, if you like this podcast, don't forget to go to Apple Podcasts. Make sure you leave a 5-star review. And let's get to that conversation with Arturo.
So why not a little bit about the island, baby?
Yeah, let's talk about the island.
So how are you, David, how long have you been living in Puerto Rico?
I've been here for 2.5 years.
2.5 years.
A little longer than that, but yeah, roughly 2.5 years.
I think one thing you have to understand that's important to understand, right, is I think culturally, right, we as Puerto Ricans do not believe we can do things ourselves, right? And I think that's part of the colonial mindset that exists on the island. And it's something that's has to be dealt with at every level, right? So we don't think it's weird. We don't think that we're as good, even though kind of, if you look at different fields, we kind of are. It's just it kind of permeates the situation where we don't think that. And then locally, the other problem is the system isn't set up on the island to let us improve things appropriately. We don't really have the control that we need to improve things, and we don't. So people who are actually good at things get frustrated and leave, right? So we have a lot of professionals like the talent. A lot of our talent leaves. And you kind of emphasize one thing I've heard you talking about is that we also don't compensate people appropriately on the island. So the actual best talent leaves, right?
Yep.
There are some, and I think I mentioned it earlier. I don't know if I mentioned it on the podcast, but I was saying one of the events, when you get to me at the level I'm at, there are some edges because even though I make less money on paper than I would in the States, the tax code on Puerto Rico is very favorable to somebody in my position. So I actually end up making a lot more money than my take home pay is more, right? Because the tax code is such that like I get breaks on the federal level and I get breaks on the state level. And there's some capital gains stuff that happens, and it's very favorable. This is why Logan Paul was thinking about moving to the right? So so it's a very weird kind of situation. But then like that means, but a lot of the professionals or little highly competent people just like don't stay on the island because it's not worthwhile. And they'll feel that they can actually change anything because, we have this mentality. And
well, there's also, it's not just a mentality. There's also when you have a lifelong, when your experience tells you nothing's going to change, then you just kind of give up and say, all right, then I'll take my talents elsewhere because it's frustrating.
I think one of the things I'm gonna highlight, which I think is kind of important, like, and they say like, oh, you can't be independent of something like the U.S. It's gonna be worse. We're independent of like, look, guys. I think the example to kind of look at now, and it didn't exist like 30 years ago, but it does now. The U.S. got to Puerto Rico like 1903. I believe Ireland became independent. I believe it's 1912, actually 1920. And Ireland, and I've talked to people from Ireland. They followed the Fomento model. With the Fomento model, I've literally talked to people from economic development in Ireland who like swear by Del Moscoso and Luis Munoz Marin what they did on the island Operation Bootstrap, right? And said, hey, we love that shit. This is what we did. And if you look, and I mentioned Ireland because Ireland's been independent for 100 years, and just like parallel path, they're now a top 3 quality of life country in the world, right? Their economy is top rate, their earnings is top rate, they have all sorts of services. And if you look at the quality of life and next to happiness, they're top 3 in the world, right? They're the best of any of the current United Kingdoms or former United. And the point being is the model they followed is the Puerto Rican development model, right? Which is kind of crazy. Like not only are they went there, when obviously there was some pain to get to where they are, but it's always been interesting to me, or it was kind of like shocking to me, that they really followed the model that we set out for development that we kind of abandoned in the 80s when the Binkowski came into power. And that's the other thing I was going to say to you. Like the other biggest problem that we have is the system of Puerto Rico is set up by the one party who set up the Commonwealth, right? The ELA. And the problem lies in that the government in power does not want the ELA to succeed. They want it to fail because they want to be a state. So part of the problem that we have is it's a little bit like the Republicans. The Republicans don't want the state to succeed. So everything's kind of fucked because they want to reduce state capacity. But then you end up like Texas, where like, fuck, well, we're in the bullseye for all these climate change disasters, and we're not going to raise taxes, but we've been insulting the people in the federal government for like 5 years. And like literally now it's like, there's no way 10 years ago when something like this happened to Texas, like people would be out there saying like, we shouldn't give them any fucking money, right? Fucking, I'm not going to give those assholes money, right? They don't want it. They don't need it. They don't need state capacity. Fuck them. We're not going to give them any aid. Like there's no way that was something that was going to be something you could say without getting slammed. I don't agree with it.
Well, Puerto Rico's been the punching bag. Puerto Rico's been the punching bag of this one forever.
Puerto Rico, yeah, but David, we're brown, right? So like we're like brown, we're brown Indians. So like
I'll tell you, this is the one thing that I've tried to explain this to people, and they just are like, "You're just saying that. It's not true." And I'm like, dude, I'm not saying that all Americanos are racist. Okay, if you're from the U.S., I'm not saying you are racist. But I guarantee you probably know a lot of fucking racist people, and bring up to them anything about Puerto Rico, bring up anything to them about Mexicans, about any kind of Latino, anybody who's not from Europe, and again, even Spain. It's just bring it up and see what they say. I guarantee there's some racist shit that follows whatever it is that their comments or opinion is. They and people that I talk with here. And again, obviously not my friends, whatever, but the people I talk with here who want to be a state in particular, just ignore that exists. They freaking ignore it. And I'm like, I don't think you understand how they look at this island. You just don't fucking get it. I live there. And when I talk to Puerto Ricans who've moved to the U.S., they experienced it. It is there. I don't know very many, if any, who had not experienced some racism.
I think one of the more interesting things that happened, and it's happened to me, right? I travel to Europe, I travel to Spain all the time. And one of the things that I noticed is that, like, I travel to the States sometimes, a lot too. And I've studied in the state, lived in the states, lived in multiple states for long periods. And we're culturally significantly closer to Spain than we are to the United States. Even as after 100 years as a colony, if you go to Spain, you will recognize the architecture, you will recognize the people, you will recognize the style of life, you will recognize pretty much everything that's going on, right? And the town centers look like the town centers on the island, like same kind of characters, same kind of people. Obviously, there are some differences, but we're much more culturally similar to them than we are to any place in the States, right? And I think that and again, I do think we are getting a little bit more of that culture here, but it's not quite where it should. But I mean, I think it's really kind of a thing where I think that we are in a place where and I know stated one last referendum on the island, but the Independencia did a lot stronger than it typically would, right? And it's kind of, if you actually look at the growth for independence movement on the island was really kind of impressive relative to what it's been before. And I think it's going to kind of move that way more because the U.S. doesn't necessarily kind of covering itself in glory. I think the U.S. right now is a mess. We talked about a little thing with Texas you have a very broken system because Reagan decided that trickle down, right? We're not going to spend any money on state capacity. Fuck giving you services. We're going to give this all to rich people. And as a short-term thing, that works because what happens is when people don't, if you think about it from the point of view of business, when you don't have access to capital or financing, in the short term, giving rich people more money leads to more projects. But that's only in the short term. Once you reduce the cost of lending and the interest rate past a certain point, then trickle down is bullshit. Because it doesn't matter how many tax breaks I can give you, you're not spending more money because you basically have enough money to do all the projects and all the capital buildings that you don't have the attention span to do it. So what happens is you take that money that I'm giving you and you use that to buy political influence, or you hoard that money. So instead of actually moving in the economy and actually creating growth like we used to before fucking Reagan, and creating middle-class jobs through growth and through infrastructure projects that we used to do before Reagan. No, instead of that, we have a bunch of people getting richer. We have the rate of earnings getting smaller because money's just not being spent in the middle, which is why I argue this all the time. I want to go back to a pre-Reagan tax code because what I really want is I want to take all that money that's sitting in the goddamn banks of the rich people and use it to build roads and build dams and build green infrastructure. Why? Because infrastructure projects lead to construction work, right?
Yep.
Construction work, contractors, and that leads to middle class jobs. And the guys who are doing the middle class jobs, if I'm doing a middle class job and I have a family, I'm going to have a house, I'm going to have a car, I'm going to spend the money in the community. I'm going to spend that money and give it to somebody else, and he's going to give it to somebody else. We're sitting in the bank of J-fuck Amazon, right?
Yep.
We're sitting in the bank of people kind of just don't understand. And it's this confusion. And again, I mentioned Texas, and the problem is you have these red states that oh, it's wonderful. I'm going to move from California to Texas. Okay. So if you actually look at this, well, Texas actually hasn't spent any money on, they have a bunch of infrastructure projects they need to do. Are you familiar with the Ike Dike?
Sorry, repeat that?
Are you familiar with the Ike Dike project?
No.
So the Ike Dike project is, the Gulf Coast basically, if the Gulf Coast basically that you see on the maps is a fiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Louisiana and Georgia and Texas coast you see on the maps in the Gulf of Mexico, that doesn't really exist. That's all been eroded away. There's a bunch of that stuff, but you look at it on a satellite, it's not there because the ocean's rising and it's driving most of that. A lot of that is underwater. And this is why every time there's a freaking event, Houston gets flooded, right? You've seen there's every time there's one of these floods, they'll do the whole thing where post the sharks in the Houston highway. You must have seen that. There's always this flood. The shark on the highway. Yeah. It's and everyone's the first lesson to post the shark on the highway. Well, and I laugh. I mean, it's not really good, but what happens is Texas doesn't have any infrastructure and they know they need to build this dike. They know they need to build these projects to channel the water. And they know they need to build these projects. But the Republicans aren't going to fucking do that because they'd have to raise taxes in the state, right?
Yep.
and they're not going to raise taxes in the state because that's not what Republicans do in Texas. But functionally, it means that really the way Texas works is Texas doesn't tax you, but they steal the money from the federal government to what they call federal transfer. So they complain about Minneapolis and they complain about California, they complain about New York, but the fuckers are actually taking the money from the blue states and the cities, and that's the money that's coming in through the Senate and going to Texas, which is why when this last storm happened, there were people who were saying, like, fuck them, don't give them any money. Because if they don't want to, like, oh, it's wonderful. Like, dude, if you don't want to tax your people, right? Yep. Well, wonderful. I'm going to take all this business from other places. Yes, but you're not actually investing in like capital. And like, so if I'm moving my business in California or New York to Texas, I'm assuming the insurance risk. Yep. Now, if I'm in Florida or I'm in Texas and the fucker is underwater, or it's like, and I'm having 100-year floods every 5 years, so I'm eating the actuary cost. So yes, it's cheaper on paper from the taxes, but wait until you get the insurance bill, yep. Right? So again, this is why, like I'm saying, like if you kind of start looking at some of this stuff, it's pretty broken right now. Like if you apply it to the island, really, I mean, we had Maria, right? And where's our aid?
Yep.
Like there's no way any state in the union would have had something like Maria happen, and you wouldn't have gotten anything. Now, we've rebuilt a lot of the infrastructure, we fixed a lot of the problems, but we really haven't gotten like there's no way we'd still have the stupid Promesa award.
Right.
Like now, again, I knew we were fucked when Biden got the nomination, and pardon my French, but I knew we were fucked because you know what they call Biden, right? You know what his nickname in the Senate was, right?
No.
The senator from MBTNA. You didn't know that?
No.
No, he the honorable senator for MBTNA. Like Biden is wholly owned by credit. Like he is wholly and he's the guy. He basically, I think the crime bill and the bank. They always mention the crime bill, but they never mention they never mentioned the bankruptcy reform. That was him too. So he is not someone who was going to ever forgive our debt. That's not something that was going to happen. Right. Hillary would have. I have a lot of problems with the Clintons, but Hillary and Bill are both allies to Puerto Rico, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bill might be a repugnant human, but he is an ally to the island. And I say that because I've literally personally seen Bill Clinton twice with my own eyes, without any press, like doing like work stuff here for charities after Maria. Him and I've literally seen him like, oh, is that Bill Clinton? Just ran lunch. Is that Bill Clinton? Yes, that's what the hell? It's like just walking around, right? Obviously, like, well, I think one was in Houston and the other was like at the convention center. But there was no press. The news wasn't there. They were just like doing some like stuff with the Clinton Foundation for charity on the island. So they do have ties on the island. They are actually allies on the island. They're not wholly owned by the creditors. So we really on the island got screwed in 2016. We got royally screwed in the 2016 election, and we got royally screwed in the 2020 election. But yeah. But I mean, like, and then we got the ex-head of the Promesa board. The ex-head, no, he wasn't that. He was the advisor, right? The advisor, right? It's like purely. So really not the ideal situation for the island. I think
you saw the op-ed in the journal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think
fucking show. What a show.
The key for Puerto Rico is that I do believe there's going to be a movement afoot to renationalize the supply chain. And if that is the case, then Puerto Rico's well placed for that because we have one of the largest concentrations of like ready to go kind of industrial space. The island is full of the fermented spaces, like the factories are just ready to go.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, I think so. We need some things to happen, but you can kind of tell, like I'm just so jaded when I like watch the stuff from the U.S. So you can kind of tell, like I call it the CIA media thing, where like you can kind of tell they're like doing all these stories about China, and like they're trying to like kind of gin up the whole thing, and like we got to talk to China and I mean, it's a really kind of a weird thing because like the problem with like picking a fight with China the way they do it is like they want to like the U.S. really kind of like wants to fight it like it was the Cold War and like we're gonna do the military thing. We're gonna kind of like Do you think the guy was talking about like how they can get to like how China can have as many bombs as we can in 10 years?
Yeah.
And they can't, right? They could, but like China doesn't. Like the thing is, China doesn't operate that way. China basically goes, okay, we just want enough nukes so that you can't bomb us or threaten us with the bombs because we can fuck you up. And we just want enough troops to basically make it so that you won't invade it. Like, so China will basically limit their expenditure on the military to just assure that it's defensive. They're like, fuck it, we're not going to spend the money on that. What China does spend money on, and this is something that you see when, again, I've been to South America, they spend it on doing all these co-development projects with developing countries, right? So they go in and say, okay, so we're going to go into Africa, we're going to go into South America, we're going to go into Venezuela, we're going to go into Bolivia, and we're going to do this project because this project will help you and it's going to increase my state capacity as China because I'm going to have an economic development project in your country, which is good because it's going to make money. And two, it's going to make you friendlier to me, right? And I'm going to increase my diplomatic capacity, right? And I'm going to create economic ties so that, like, when the U.S. starts rattling sabers, China can go, hey, they're gonna fuck up your economy, man. Like, which is the whole.
And one of the things that they've done, and the reason they've done this, and this is what's played out in Africa, is they make promises to a dictator or whichever person's running the country. They come in, and part of the plan is we're going to build a power plant, a water facility, whatever it is. And we're going to not only provide this for your people, but we're also going to hire them. Then what they do is they turn around once the project is approved, and they do it with their own workers. They literally import their own workers in to do the work and not pay the locals.
But ultimately, for some of this stuff, a lot of this stuff, they create the project and they do actually the infrastructure and they do actually do the economic ties and running. And because having the business, because in essence, even though they leave it to the locals, they still own a share, or basically they're creating economic influx in another country that isn't actually part of their own country because it becomes, from an economic standpoint, it makes sense because they're less dependent on their own economy. And they're also increasing their state capacity because they have more influence. It's the whole thing, the last time we did the whole saber rattling thing during, what happened during Trump? The Hong Kong thing. So the Hong Kong thing, there's a whole thing about how some of that Hong Kong protest was kind of being manipulated. Depending on which news, if you're reading European news or you're reading state news, it was very different, right? Which happens a lot. I always advise people, hey, if you, I always tell people from the States, you should always find an alternative news source that isn't U.S. media, right?
Yep.
Be it France 24, be it TV, be it Tennis. Tennis here is a little weird because it's Venezuela, so it can be a little biased. Or same thing with Al Jazeera, but it's only France 24 for BBC World Service or TV will have a much more unbiased take on the U.S. BBC can be BBC will have its own issues, right? But you can kind of use it to create a kind of a biased sector, right? So you'll see the British bias in something, and you'll see the US bias. So the whole Hong Kong thing, if you're reading it on the Spanish press, and the Spanish international press was reading completely different. Same thing with the Bolivia stuff. Bolivia is the classic case. The whole thing about the coup in Bolivia, that if you were reading it anywhere but the New York Times, they were doing a freaking goddamn coup. Whereas the New York Times was no, it's not a coup. Until 3 months later, they know, well, yeah, it actually was a coup.
Yep.
It just kills me. But the whole thing being that when the Hong Kong thing happened, which is the last time we did the saber rattle thing, what happened there? Daryl Morey did that statement, and what did China do? China put pressure on the NBA, economic pressure on them. China basically fucked up the NBA. They really fucked them up.
Yeah.
They cut off their revenue. They put pressure on places, people like Disney, and they put pressure on all the broadcast partners for the NBA, and the NBA had to shut that shit down fast as fuck, right?
Yep.
And the point being that we get into these sites. For us, it's convenient for Puerto Rico because it's never made sense for us to export our industrial capacity to China. Because what would happen, because again, I used to do this. I used to have to do this for GE. I used to have to do this. They were exporting. They're dude, if you're exporting them and they're going to steal, you're going to put a factory there and they're going to build a copy factory next door and build the product cheaper.
Yep.
That's what they did. And you're also going to create a huge problem with your supply chain. No, okay, fine. And a classic, which is what happened here. So what you want to do is you want to bring all that shit back. And damage is done. They've already got their industry set up, but like, really, that's going to favor us. But like, again, the problem is like, we get into these fights with China, and really, this is not fighting Soviet. This is not, you're bringing guns to a money fight.
Yeah.
Right. And it's because you're not going to shoot nukes at China. China knows you're not going to shoot nukes at them. They know you are not going to land troops in China. They've got 1 billion people. You're not landing troops in China. That's not happening. Right.
Yeah.
So and also they know, because they also know that if you do that, like if you're the president of the United States and you decide to go into land conflict in Asia, particularly against China, you know you are fucking up your economy, right?
Yep.
Your economy.
How many Fortune 500s and others are reliant on manufacturing in China? It's not, you can't get into bed with someone and then complain when they fart. It's just how it works. Like, and this is the part that I hear people saying that the U.S. wants to do all these different projects and things. There's no will for it. There's no political will for it. There's no finance. I mean, as long as these companies keep making money, they're not going to stop selling to 1 billion fucking people and making their stuff there.
I think the trick is we have to get way more protectionist as this is like now speaking as part of the US. You have to get more protectionist with your supply chain. You have to understand the thing that like the Japanese and Toyota understood like in the 70s, which is like you want to manufacture where you self-ship. Where Toyota's manufactured, they're manufactured in Tennessee and California. They're manufactured in Germany. They're manufactured in where's the other factory? I believe it's in Czechoslovakia. They manufacture shit where they're going to sell it because they want to create one. They know that like by manufacturing, you want to manufacture in the community, create jobs in the community, because that also creates political kind of clout for you to kind of defend that. But translate that
creates wealth. That also creates wealth so you can buy your products. Like, shocking.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've made our economy kind of inflation proof by like having these broad global supply chains, but then we've also made it so that like that's been done at the cost of like between that and capital gains, we fucked up the entire middle class of the country because we basically moved all the wealth to the people who've taken offshore, and that's not the way to. You don't like money that's sitting in a fucking bank is not helping anybody, and that's kind of the thing that like I joke about like how FDR knew how to solve this problem. Like, yeah, FDR knew. I like a friend of mine was like, FDR knew how to solve this problem. How do you solve the economy? You tax the rich, you build bridges, you build roads, you build dams, you build infrastructure projects. Because we don't build. When was the last? I tell you, like, what is the last major big infrastructure projects they built in the United States? It's a big dig in Boston. I think that they broke ground on that in like 1996.
Yeah, that's a great point. So. Tell me this. Explain something to me. I know the answer, but I just want to hear someone say it. Why don't things change here in Puerto Rico?
The autoridad to do shit, right? Because there's political parties in there, and there's a whole thing, and we cannot force them to do this.
Well, therein lies the problem. So all of this are the politicians have no incentive to make it better.
Yeah,
they're doing well, and they're doing quite well. And so are, quite frankly, the Puerto Ricans elite, the wealthy Puerto Ricans who are here. And now you got the Act 20 people, and they're doing well too. There's no incentive to change it. So to your point, we've got to build it here. We have to do it ourselves because they're not going to help us. And that's the only way we can have a future where we can eventually call our own shots. And I don't know why that concept is so hard for some people to get, but that's what that is what has to happen.
And we haven't brought it, but I think let's close with this, right? So there's an old argument we used to have, which is like, oh, look at how Ireland got, like, Ireland was like, I think it was like, they was called the sick man of Europe back when, like, so Ireland got independence, I think it was in the 1940s. And so one of the arguments was like, oh, you can't be independent because look how bad Ireland did after independence from England. Oh, dude, Ireland basically implemented the Fomento model. I've talked to people from Ireland. They implemented the Fomento model to like, it basically turned Ireland from, that to one of the top 3 economies in the world. Like the GDP in Ireland is like quality of life, and by all measures, it is one of the top. And how did they do that? Because they went their own, like they controlled their own destiny, they had a company, and they sat there and built it. And the funny thing is, they like when I've talked to the people in like industry in Ireland, they knew who was money once, they knew what the notable Kosovo was. And like, yeah, we just did we just ate your model, right? And the model in Puerto Rico freaking worked for 40 years. The problem is like once half the island decided, like half the politicians on the island said like, well, no, we want to be a state. We don't want to continue on this path. And we need to we need to basically make this not work. And once they stop working towards making Puerto Rico better, and this is the part that's like, we're not going to make Puerto Rico better because we want to be a state, right? We don't want the thing that's currently working now to work. And again, I'm not arguing for I'd say, look, we need to, as a people, say like, again, Luis Muñoz Marin's famous phrase, el estatus no está en issue. The status is not the issue.
Yep.
Right? I don't care about, like, the status is an issue to be settled like later on. We can settle it later on. And actually, I particularly don't care. I want to fix conditions on the ground, right? We need to focus on fixing conditions on the ground. Because once we fix conditions on the ground, right, then we can actually worry about the status. I do think the problem is that, like, the current status that we have does not allow Puerto Rico the powers that it needs to solve this. The governor of Puerto Rico does not have the tools and powers at his disposition to solve the problems that he needs to solve. Right? And that is a consequence of being a colony. So this is why I say, like, look, I think the first part is, and I've said this, I want to negotiate a treaty like the tribes have, where they negotiate an autonomous territory treaty, which gives them power of treaty, gives them the power of law, right? Like the Oklahoma tribes, the tribes in New Mexico, they have the power. They have more economic power. They have more economic sovereignty over their land, right? And they're still citizens of the U.S. They're still part of the U.S., right? But they have a much more clearly defined relationship to the government of the United States, and they have a much more clearly defined relationship about, like, sovereignty, right? You couldn't, like, again, they're not on an island, but you couldn't force, like, the tribes into a cabotage law. Hawaii is not on the cabotage law, right? But we are, for some freaking reason. So we, in essence, as Puerto Ricans, because we have this weird status that is currently defined, we are second-class citizens relative to everybody else in the U.S. We do not have the rights that even the territories in the U.S. have, right? And this is where, like, people kind of like, look, and this is the argument that Arturo was making, and Hernandez Colon was making. It's like, I would like to get us to the point where we have the same rights as other territories of the U.S., right? Because if we can get to that point, then we have a lot more freedom and a lot more kind of ability to negotiate properly and fix the problems that we currently have, right? We need those tools. If I don't have a hammer, how the hell am I going to get that nail into the wood, right? And again, we can decide what it means after, but saying, hey, I would like to be on equal footing to the other territories of the United States is a fair thing, right?
And it's attainable. I think it's attainable.
Yes.
It's much more attainable.
And I think what's going to end up happening, particularly as, like, the independence movement on the island grows, and I was explaining this to the friends from the States, like, once you know that protesting works, right? We kicked the government out of office, right? And we kicked him out of office. And then when this one got in, like, when she got fresh, we went there and basically, like, we scared the crap out of her too, right? Because we know that, like, this is, there was a great line from somebody who was dating a French guy, right? And they were he was watching the news and he was like, well, things are bad. Like, if you don't go out and burn buildings, how will anything get fixed, right? Because he's basically, like, explaining his experience from Europe, where, like, in France, when shit gets bad, people will go out and they will go out and, like, protest, like really protest and get things done. And they have a 4-day work week, and they have infrastructure, and they have social benefits, because, you start learning, hey, if sometimes direct action works, right? Going out, like, doing a mass strike and that kind of thing will work. And once that genie's out, people kind of figure out, like, hey, this is how we do things. So I do think that that's more our future. And I do think that, like, the way to kind of channel it is, hey, we want to start doing things that give us more control of our economy and our destiny. And that really is kind of the way to sell it in the States, because one thing that's going to happen is all these old politicians are going to start dying, right? And I don't mean this in a bad way. It's just, Pelosi's 80 years old, and so is Schumer, and these are, like, old, decrepit politicians. And, like, they're going to start dying, and you're going to start getting a much younger, kind of more progressive crowd. And I think we need to be a little more, we need to be smarter than, say, Israel, was being really dumb about this and being like, oh, we can rely on these old politicians to always, they'll let us get away with shit forever. No, dude, you gotta have to assume they're not going to let you get away with shit forever. And now that you actually can get away with shit, it's the time to actually like negotiate concessions.
Right? Exactly.
Now's the time to start saying, hey, let me shift. Like when you have the edge is when you want to negotiate. So I do think that like the play for us as Puerto Ricans is start going like, hey, we're not getting treated fairly as citizens, but not just like, I think the statehood is just, we're not going to get that. I think like we're not getting treated fairly as a territory of the United States, right? You're discriminating against us in terms, the common rights laws are discrimination, right?
Yep.
Not being able to negotiate economic treaties is discrimination. Not having full control of our courts is discrimination, right? I don't necessarily want to be part of the circuit court. I want to have the Puerto Rican Supreme Court kind of be a little more independent. I would like the Constitution to be a little more independent. Again, I want economic independence. I do want some regulatory and I want some legal kind of independence. Like this is enhanced powers for the country. Now, whether that leads us into statehood or independence or whatever it leads us, it's not bad to say, hey, I'd like to be able to solve the problem that I have on the island, right? And I think
exactly
that's where we kind of have to kind of start heading to and thinking. And again, I think ultimately we need to do these things because, and I said this earlier, the United States that helped us build the infrastructure and fix the stuff here is not, I don't think it's a United States system anymore. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, David. You're from the States. Do you think that it's realistic for anybody on the island to expect the U.S. is going to come here and like rebuild the infrastructure of the island?
Given the history of the last 40 years, I would say no. However, timing's everything. Biden just announced he wants to go big on infrastructure. They're announcing Pittsburgh next week. So we'll see if that affects us or not. Hopefully it does. But he's trying to make big bets, which he has to do, in my opinion. You and I've talked about this offline, and you've mentioned it here about your thoughts on the Democrats in 2024 and all these things. If he doesn't go big and nail it, then we're never getting help again. That's how I feel about it.
I think, again, the tack for us on that is understand that there is a clear anti-China agenda from both parties in foreign policy that they've been trying to push for a decade, right?
Yep.
And again, they're trying to push it militarily, and that's dumb. They're bringing basically tanks to economic fight. Functionally, the way to kind of play it is to go full bore on let's onshore manufacturing onto the island, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you can actually get into that where they're onshoring manufacturing, and I say onshoring is a lot of manufacturing from Puerto Rico got offshored to China. And I remember being in meetings 50 years ago and say, like, you're being stupid. They're going to steal from you, right? This is stupid. They're going to steal from you. And you're creating this massive supply chain, like, that is easily interruptible. And lo and behold, I was right. But anyway, like, we want to onshore on the island. And if you want to onshore on the island because we have the personnel and the facilities, you have to invest in infrastructure on the island. So the more industry you can actually get to come back to the island, the better off you're going to be, because the U.S. then your pharmaceutical companies and your electronic companies will convince politicians to invest in the island, right? But again, even there, because you and I have talked about like doing businesses, and even there, if we could actually get around the cabotage laws, right, then it would actually make Puerto Rico even more attractive, because then you get cheap shipping, right?
Yep.
And if you can reduce shipping costs to the island, then it's really like, if you can reduce shipping costs and you can actually like do electric generation like a Gulf. So you replace infrastructure, you reduce shipping costs, and you reduce energy costs, then Puerto Rico is very attractive to manufacture, right? But you need to have somebody in charge on the island whose focus is that and understands how to generate and what they call an attractive greenfield location in manufacturing.
Yep.
Which is, again, we talked a lot on island. When I talk to them, they clearly understand, how do I make island attractive to investment, right?
Yep.
How do I make this attractive? Well, people have to want to live there. So schools have to be nice, and infrastructure has to be, the cost of operating has to be low, right? And I need to be able to get shit there. I need to be able to shit out quickly. And the problem in Puerto Rico is I have to fly. I either have to ship everything through Jacksonville, right? On really basically at like extortion prices. So these are if you're trying to fix Puerto Rico economically, these are the things you have to fix, right?
Yep.
And then independence guy, somebody independence will like, well, then you also have to tax the companies. Like, that's fine. We can pass a BAT, right? We can talk about tax laws. But like, we can say, hey, like, once you actually get money flowing into the island, then we can put like, are you familiar with what a VAT is?
Yes.
So basically, it's an evolution of the sales tax. So we're basically, you want to tax then on the motion of money throughout your economy, but I need to fix the motion of money through my economy first before I do that, right?
Yep.
And a lot of the tax base on the island is getting like, in essence, the federal government is taking the tax money as it comes into the island through the boats, right?
Right.
So if we can actually like, if you, instead of like paying for the cost of the good, that's like when you buy like a Chips Ahoy, right? That Chips Ahoy is coming from Illinois on a fucking train, on a train or on a truck to Jacksonville getting shipped here. That shipping cost, basically, is getting tacked on to your grocery bill. So instead of getting a 2x multiplier on the grocery bill of that Chips Ahoy, you'll get a VAT tax on it, which will be much less. The cost of the good will drop, but also the income for the government of Puerto Rico will increase. Functionally, we need politicians and we need parties that are focused on fixing the problems, right?
Yeah.
But we also need politicians to actually know what the fucking problem is. And I don't think, because I listen to local radio sometimes, I look at what they're saying. I haven't gotten the feeling that nobody of the guys, even the third parties, really know and understand these issues, which is kind of really frustrating. Have you? I mean, am I crazy here?
No, I was told early on that if I wanted to get things done, don't bother trying to work with the government anyway, because they're not going to help you. That was what I was told, straight up. This is by locals. That any initiative, because the system they have in place now works for them, and it works for those who are getting benefits from that. So there's no reason to change it. So they're not looking at a solution because to them the solution's already here.
Well, I mean,
but they will say
that was the point of my story. Talking to we were Puerto Ricans in these Fortune 500 companies trying to solve problems to perpetuate industry on the island, and the government didn't want to fucking listen to us.
Yep. I
literally screamed at the guy who was the head of Momentum. And I literally screamed and said, you are a complete another fuck, right? And it was funny because one of my best friends, was the ex-head of, I used to work for Fritco. He was the ex-head of Fritco for a previous summer. He was the co-captain of my swim team in high school. I both went to high school together. And so he's standing there laughing with me. I'm getting pissed at the guy. And he's standing there laughing. He was a PPD guy. And so the guy I'm screaming at is a statehood guy. Because they really don't want us to, we were trying to fix the energy problem. Look, we're going to spend all this fucking, we are going to put the infrastructure costs down of fixing your energy infrastructure. Because again, the problem with the energy infrastructure on the island is it's too fucking expensive to fix right now. The last plant that was built on the island, by the way, was designed by my dad, was built on the south side on the island, and it's the one that gives us power in Iowa, which is generally why we have consistent power, right? My dad put in the design and did the plant. But that's the newest one. I think that's, that's got to be 30 years old, right? I remember the plans. The plans were in my house, right? We were trying to build there's a whole thing, and you can ask, Galletti was the plant. There was a carbon plant we were trying to build. But really, the story about this is a funny story, which is there were two proposals, right? Galletti, which was a carbon plant, which my dad knew was going to get voted down. So they made the plan, they made the Galletti plant, and they knew the Galletti plant was never going to fly, right? But they still did the proposal because they knew their Galletti was going to get voted down. But then we can do this plant, which is the plant we actually want to do, right? So whenever we got pissed and voted down the carbon plant, here's the plant we actually want to do. But this is in the 90s. It's this really is 30 years ago when it's and really the capacity that's all installed on the island, part of the problem is it's all 50, 60 years old, right? And so we would come in and say, hey, we will build generation for all these fucking towns, right? Because, you're not when you're building an energy generation project, you're not building small, the small is cost. So I want to build a big one. And then what my cost benefit is, I'm going to build it. I'm going to sell it to you, right? I'm going to sell it cheaper than you because I can make it I'm beat. This is technology that's 50 years newer than whatever the fuck you built, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to be able to sell it to you at fraction of the cost. But the benefit to me is I'll basically be able to write off my energy bill, right?
Yep.
I'll write the fuck off, and I'll be able to sell to you, and like I will make the quality of life on the island better than my it's like, no, fuck, we're not gonna negotiate a transmission policy. Fuck you. Like,
All right, let's wrap it up.
Anyway.
Let's wrap it up. So
I think the key message is, guys, if I can reach my people in Puerto Rico, it's like, guys, you need to get smarter about what you're asking for, right? And you need to understand the wisdom of the patriarch of Puerto Rico, which is el estatus no está en issue, right? Forget about status. Status is the problem. Infrastructure is the problem. Economy is the problem. Growth is the problem, right?
Yep.
And if you can actually kind of internalize that and understand that, we will be in a much better place of like, no, it's not enough. Like, no. Focus on, okay, so even if you wanted statehood, you're going to have to solve the problems and make yourself more attractive to the U.S. than you are now. Right now, you are not attractive to a Republican Senate. Ain't going to happen.
Yep.
So you need to think about how do you make yourself, this is like the Cosmo cover. How, like, why doesn't he like, well, dude, you need to work on yourself first, right?
Hey,
so you need.
You saw you saw my GIF the other day with Chuck Schumer and Pedro saying he's just not that into you. There's a reason for that. Well, Arturo, thank you again for coming on. Thank you for the history lesson. For those who aren't listening and don't know any of this stuff, I hope you did learn something. I did as well, as I'm always trying to learn. But you can follow Arturo, by the way, on Twitter at American Numbers. And his other handle is Data Strictly. If you just want to look at him running numbers and models and data and all that fun stuff. I'm Binkowski. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure you rate and subscribe. And especially if you are using Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review and 5 stars. We'll see you next episode. Thank you.